Hey there guys, today's lesson we're going to talk all about software distribution. Now there's a number of different ways to distribute software. We're going to talk about the two main ways, which are proprietary versus non-proprietary. So let's go. So this presentation gets the fairly cryptic title of The Goat versus Monopoly Man. So what is that all about? Well, really, when we talk about the two main distribution methods for software, we're really talking about free and open source stuff, or what we call non-proprietary. We'll get to the significance of the GOAT in a minute, versus proprietary software, or that software distributed mainly by big companies, but doesn't have to be, but it's normally big companies. And the Monopoly Man indicates that really that sort of software is mainly all about making money. So let's have a closer look at those two types. So with our two types of software, being proprietary and non-proprietary, really the fundamental difference between them really comes down to one main thing, and that is really ownership of the software. With proprietary software, which can include these main different types of software, we've got commercial software, which is generally sold by a larger software company or a smaller software company, but all designed to make a profit. We sell it for money. Freeware also sits underneath the proprietary software model. Now, even though freeware isn't tend to be sold for a profit, it still sits under proprietary software, and we'll talk a bit more about that and just why that is. And shareware is also another model, and there are other models that could fit in under proprietary software. But essentially, the key is that ownership of the software, and particularly the source code, stays with the owner or the creator of that software. Okay, so they keep ownership, and the user of the software doesn't get any rights over the software. Their rights to use it tend to be restricted by the license agreement, which is a totally different scenario to non-proprietary software. Now, the significance of the GOAT here, the GOAT is really the logo for a piece of non-proprietary software called the GNU project, which was an operating system, a free operating system that was developed by a guy named Richard Stallman in the early 80s. Around about 1983, he started the GNU project and produced an open source operating system, and he released it for free. So that was really one of the early forms of non-proprietary software. So it's not designed for companies to make a profit. So we tend to have two main types of non-proprietary, and these are quite different. Well, there's a lot of similarity, but they have some differences over the free software, and that's really all about the free software movement versus the open source software movement. Both are non-proprietary, both have a lot of similarities, both allow a lot greater freedom for the user in terms of what they can do with the software than proprietary software allows. But and it doesn't necessarily mean to say that non-proprietary can't actually be sold for a profit either. It actually can at times. So we'll talk a little bit more about that too. But that's the significance of the GOAT. It's really the GNU project, and its logo has kind of come to represent, I suppose, the free software and the open source software movement. So it gets a bit confusing when we've got these two different concepts of free software and freeware, which both have the word free in them. So what's the difference there really? What's that mean, and how are they the same and how are they different? Well, there's not a lot of similarity about them at all. In fact, freeware is one of our proprietary types of software. Which means that somebody retains ownership of that software. Even if something is free, it's not free. It's free in terms of its monetary value, and you can download it and install it for free, and you can use it. It doesn't cost you anything. But what you don't get with freeware is the ability to access the source code of that software. You don't get any access to that code. So you've got no ownership, no access, no ability to make any kind of modifications to that code. That software works how it works, and you can do with it what you can do with it. The things that it's been designed to do by the programmer, and you're really just limited to those features and those functions. And if you need an update, if there's an error or an issue with the software, you need to wait for the programmer or the company who owns that software to release an update. Okay, so there's no freedom for the user in terms of what they can really do with it. They're bound by the terms of a license agreement, and while it's free in terms of a monetary sense, they don't have to pay for it, they have no freedom over the source code, no access to the source code, which is the fundamental difference with free software. Okay, so free software is free in every way. It is free in the financial sense, in that it doesn't cost anything to purchase it, but it's also free in the sense that you do get access to the source code, and you can, as a user, if you know how, if you've got the skills, modify that software and change the way it works so that it works the way you want, not necessarily the way it was designed to work. So you've got freedom in how you can use it, and you've got freedom, total freedom, in what you can do with it, to the extent that you can modify it to work how you want it to work. Now there's really two movements, as I mentioned before. There's two main movements in this free software area, and they are the free software movement and the open source initiative. So we've heard all about, most of us I think have heard about open source software. Well, that's just really another type of non-proprietary software which is quite similar to the free software movement. The main difference between these guys really is that the free software movement says software should be free in every sense of the word, free financially, free in what you can do with it, and users have total freedom over their software. The open source initiative and the open source movement, similar but not quite the same. They still believe that the creator of a piece of software has copyright rights over that work, and should still be able to be acknowledged for the work, and also actually should be able to be rewarded financially for any work. So open source software, well, generally it's free. It doesn't actually have to be. You are able to charge for open source software under the open source software agreement. Okay, so you can actually take software that is open source, get access to the source code because it's part of this free software concept where you get that, modify it, reasonably significant modification, and be able to on-sell that as your own version of that product and profit from it. So that's something slightly different for where the open source initiative, the open source movement, differs a little bit from the free software movement, which doesn't really condone that kind of practice in relation to software at all. So looking at that in a little more detail, I suppose the license agreements are critical for software, regardless of what the software is, whether it's a proprietary piece of software or whether it's a non-proprietary piece of software. Everything is going to have a license agreement attached to it of some sort. The license agreement dictates what the user's rights are and what their responsibilities are. So in the open source and free software world, this GNU public license, or the GPL, the General Public License, is really the main template, I guess, for the license agreements for most software in this kind of in this world, whether it be open source or free software. The GNU General Public License was the license written for that GNU project operating system software that I mentioned earlier, back in the early 80s by Richard Stallman. And it's kind of been adopted as almost the standard, de facto standard for license agreements in the free and open source world. And if you read license agreements for free software or open source software, you'll see a lot of similarity in the language used and the terms and conditions of them. And most of them tend to be based on the General Public License, which is available online. You can Google that and you could find that license. Proprietary software licenses tend to be quite different and a lot of variation in what the user is allowed to do with that software. So you've got single user licenses, which are typically you buy a copy and you can use it once on one computer, intended mainly for one user. You can get multi-user licenses where you can generally install on one or more devices. There'd be some sort of a limit typically on how many you can install it on. In an education or in a business context, you can have a site license which is normally unlimited, but it's not necessarily unlimited. Some site licenses still actually have a maximum number of seats that you can, or computers that you can install those licenses on, but they tend to be pretty large. True site licenses are every device in your organisation that you can install it on. Shareware licenses, we're all pretty aware of those sorts of things. Usually the software is free to download, and shareware also means you can distribute the software. You can't change it, but you can distribute. But often at some point there's usually some requirement to pay. Either the software stops working after a certain number of times or a certain period, or you get nag screens and that sort of stuff asking you to pay or donate. Those sorts of licenses tend to be shareware, and you've also got the donateware and crippleware and those sorts of things where the software parts of it stop working after a period of time. So there's lots of different variations of the shareware license. And then you've got the free software license, which I've also talked about, which is free in a monetary sense, but not free in terms of the user sense. You can't do absolutely whatever you want with the software. There are still restrictions in that license. So every bit of software would have a license agreement. You need to read that carefully, but generally you've got the free or open source variant of the license, and then you've got varying types of proprietary software which outline various restrictions that the users have placed on them. So just to finish off, just want to have a quick look at the open source definition. So we're looking more at open source software here, so the non-proprietary variety of software we call open source software. And in the open source initiative, which you can go and have a read of the entire license down here, it's on the opensource.org website. Their license agreement has some pretty strict conditions, but I've just picked out a few of those things to highlight some key criteria for open source software. That you need to be able to redistribute the software, so users have to be allowed to do that under the open source license. If you're not allowed to do that, then you're not actually following the open source movement's license agreement. So you need to be allowed, users are allowed to redistribute that software, so you can give it away. You can even sell it if you've made some changes to it and you made it your own version. You're actually entitled to profit financially from open source software, and there are companies around that do that. You must make available your source code, whether that comes as a part of the program when you download it, or you've got it available online somewhere so that users can go and get it if they want to. But that must be made available with the software in some form, and that's one of the requirements for a piece of software being distributed under the open source model. And it also has to allow what are called derived works. In other words, if you've got the ability, or a person, individual or a company wants to get a piece of open source software, doesn't quite meet their needs exactly, they can modify it. They can do that because they've got access to the source code, and they can make that software do what they want it to do, and then use it within their organisation for whatever that function is. Or they've also got the right, if they want, to redistribute and sell their version of that software, which they think obviously works slightly better for their purposes. So they've got the right to be able to sell that. There's a bunch of other rights as well in the open source initiative, open source software definition, which is available down here if you want to go and have more of a read. But they're probably the big keys to that definition. The big difference with the free software movement is really this one about having the ability to sell that software. That's pretty much the fundamental difference between open source software and the free software from the free software movement. Okay, so that's pretty much it for our look through software distribution. They're the keys that I think you need to know about. So I hope that made sense.